since it is Gunpowder Day, or Guy Fawkes Day, I want to start out by describing a massive explosion. So not the explosion that didn't happen underneath the House of Commons in Parliament, but one that happened in 1280 AD, so the 13th century, the end of the 13th century. In China, in the city of Yangzhou, there was a huge explosion. Huge, maybe the biggest human-caused explosion in history up to that point. A massive arsenal, one of various ones that were around China at the time, exploded. Some powder smiths were making gunpowder, and they were inexperienced. They were replacements for people who had been there before and been removed because they were loyal to the old regime, possibly. And so these inexperienced powder smiths let a spark get into the powder, and the spark got into some weapons. They were called fire lances, and they began to shoot out flames and sparks. And at first that wasn't such a big deal, but then it got into other weapons, rockets, and then it got into a subterranean storage unit filled with bombs, huge thunder bombs they were called. And are we resonating? And the bombs exploded, and it was huge explosion. For 30 miles away, tiles were blown off roofs. And people at the time described this as a Feng, or bomb wind, they called it, which is the first use in history, so far as I know, of the term shockwave. And the shockwave blew huge beams, almost whole trees, 3 miles away, and there was a massive crater, at least 10 feet deep, and hundreds of people died, and it was a massive explosion. Now, I'm starting off this way because in 1280 AD, that was a time, just a decade after gunpowder was first described in the West. When Roger Bacon, around 1269 or so, he described gunpowder, and he said, you might use this for weapons in addition to other things. But the Europeans hadn't even tried weapons. By this point in history, the Chinese had been using gunpowder in weapons for at least 300 years. And maybe you've heard this, heard the saying that the Chinese invented gunpowder, but they just used it for fireworks, and they never thought to use it for weapons. As a matter of fact, Steve and I were talking to someone this morning who raised this myth and asked why that was the case, and I said, come to my lecture. Are you here? He's not here. But anyway, China had a long tradition with gunpowder and gunpowder weapons. They began using weapons almost immediately. And so I've been studying this history and comparing it to the history of the West. And it has to do with a deep debate that's going on in global history. So there's a sort of old model, which maybe you've heard, that says that the West, Europe, about 1500 or so, began a unique path of development, and that it led them to modernity, to greater power, to greater technological capacities, to superior economic growth, to industrialization. Right? This is a very standard idea. And it's based in things like the Renaissance and science and things like that. But in the past decade or so, a little longer than a decade, a group of historians and sociologists have attacked this idea. They've attacked this old model. They're known as the revisionists because they're revising it, and this is a label that they accept. They say that in fact, 1500 wasn't that much of a big deal. That until 1800, or so 300 years later than 1500, Europe and Asia were on very parallel paths, very similar paths. And it wasn't until 1800 or so that Europe then diverged and Europe went away. Now this is important in terms of timing, but it's also important because the traditionalists believe that the causes of this divergence had to do very much with European culture, with a legacy of science, with Renaissance Inquisition and a deeper legacy of Inquisition, of curiosity, with representative government, things like that. And the revisionists say that this late divergence was due to luck, that it wasn't due to any deep innate cultural practices or institutions necessarily, that it was because Europe had certain lucky things, like they had coal in the right places, it was wet coal, and they were closer to the New World and had colonies and a number of other things like that. So you can see that this kind of argument, this revisionist argument, would raise some hackles. And in fact, Another group of historians has come back, and sociologists have come back and argued back. And the debate keeps getting more and more and more intense. And the stakes are high because if the revisionists are right, and this great path to modernity was just due to luck, then that matters because of how we arrange our societies today, what we think are important today. If it's all luck, then what does it matter? Do we really have to, say, keep representative government up and property rights and science and things like that, or is it just a matter of luck? So it's a very important debate. People are getting very sort of up in arms about it. And this is just a small sampling of the books that are published in it. And if I had done the articles, it would fill page after page after page. Dozens of books and hundreds of articles over the last decade have been fighting this back and forth. And most of the argument has had to do with economics. Almost, I'd say 95% of it has had to do with economics. And the revisionists say, economically, China and developed parts of Asia were as rich as the West. They were economically very diversified. There was a lot of economic growth in similar ways to Europe, etc. And they debate endlessly about things like wages in Gdansk for low-income workers and all sorts of very esoteric things. But the debate doesn't seem to be getting too far. And one of the things that the traditionalists are asking is, if Asia was so powerful before 1800, then why is it that Europeans had 3 centuries of victory over Asians, right? Why is it that there's colonialism and great power for Europeans for those 300 years? And they argue back and forth about that. But the problem is we don't really know much about Asian military history. We know next to nothing. Our history departments these days rarely have military history people in them. And those who they do have in them tend to study the West, so that we know basically 2 or 3 orders of magnitude less about Asian military history than about Western military history. And so I've been researching the military history of China to look at this question of the military balance between East and West, and to understand the background, and to get at this debate, this revisionist debate. And so where have my investigations led? What can we learn? Well, I should say first that this is the first time I'm presenting any of this work. I've been working on it for about 3 years. I've got a draft of the book, but I haven't presented it in full. So this is an experiment, and if you have questions, please let me know, and any comments or something, I'd be very happy to hear them. But my I'll just say a few things about my basic conclusion, and then I'll go into some details. First, the Chinese lead was early. They started making weapons very early, and that lead continued until at least 1400 or so, and then a small divergence opened up around 1475. But the Chinese quickly adapted and adopted so that you could say that the great military divergence didn't open up until 1700s or so. So some of what I'm saying is going to support the revisionist argument. But it's a little more complicated than that, because the reasons of it go deeper. But let's just get into some. Let's talk about guns, shall we? And weapons. Oops, wrong way. So this is sort of standard view. Even if the idea of the gun, as well as the gunpowder, had reached Europe from China, the fact remains that the Europeans very swiftly outstripped the Chinese and every other people in gun design, and continued to enjoy a clear superiority in this art until World War II. So, is this true, is the first question. And the answer is, it depends what you mean very swiftly. Because for centuries, the Chinese had a tremendous lead in gunpowder weapons. Gunpowder was born in the 800s and very quickly adapted to military use. But gunpowder at first wasn't gunpowder. They didn't know, they didn't have the benefit of modern chemistry, all the things that we know now. Chinese alchemists were working to isolate various compounds, and they isolated saltpeter, which is a nitrate salt, and the nitrate salt has nitrogen atoms bound to oxygen atoms, lots of oxygen, and so combustion, we know, takes oxygen, right? And so if you have oxygen in the reaction doesn't need air to sustain it, and so this is why gunpowder was such an effective thing. But anyway, they isolated these compounds and then mixed them together, and there's a story that some guy blew up his lab. But at first they put other things in, and the early mixtures were not the gunpowder that we know now. They didn't explode in the same way. They burned very fiercely, and it took a long time to figure out the proper proportions to make these sort of really explode. But they did immediately begin using them in weapons, and this is fun. This is an early weapon, a firebird, and the idea is this bird is clearly expendable. You put a little bit of gunpowder around its neck, light it on fire, and you shoo it towards your enemy town and hope that the bird nestles into some straw or something and starts a fire for the whole town. Now, the idea is that early gunpowder weapons were much more to start fires. It was much more conflagrative than explosive. Now, just so you don't think that I'm just looking at China in this case, here you go. Hey, there we go. Yeah, Europeans get in on the whole animal thing. We've got, this is a firebird up there, and then a fire cat. And if you kidnap a cat that belongs in the city, right, and then you put gunpowder on it, and it crawls into its house and sets the house on fire while it dies. But these early weapons, there's a whole bunch of early weapons, and it's fun to see them. It feels like at the beginning of any technology. I was looking at early pictures of bicycles the other day, and the standard bicycle that we have, the 2 wheels, there were all sorts of weird forms in the 1800s when they were making bicycles. Some that had like 4 wheels and 3 little wheels and a wheel inside, and another petticoat kind of toggled along. But at the beginning of any technology, you see all that sort of huge, diverse number of really cool things. And I won't talk about those very much, but they're very exciting. Things like rolling logs, where you'd basically put a bunch of fireworks in a log and have it roll towards the enemy, and then it would explode. Flying rats, things like that. They tried all sorts of things, not real rats, but these were called, in this case it wasn't an actual animal, it would fly around like a rat. One of them went up the Empress's skirt, by the way, in a demonstration, and that didn't go very well. But eventually, they began to be used in sort of what you might call proto-guns. And this is probably the earliest image of a gun or proto-gun or some kind of expulsory gunpowder weapon in history from about 1,000 famous Dunhuang caves in China. Up there in the upper right, you see that there's a demon, and he's trying to put the Buddha off his meditation by shooting him with gunpowder. So we know that it was used in battles, and other textual sources suggest that this was the case. But these early guns this is a much later image of them, but they were used much earlier than the 1300s. They were long sticks, and the stuff, so you would put gunpowder in it, and you'd march at the front of an army with long poles, and then the fire would spray at the enemy, and then started putting things in them. Like you can see little caltrops there, little spikes and stuff, and so those would then be expelled with the gunpowder. But we were not talking about real guns. An actual gun has to have a bullet that kind of includes the whole barrel, covers the whole barrel, so that all the force of the gunpowder, builds up and then propels that out. In this case, these bullets, although they could be pretty accurate and could go pretty far, nothing compared to what a true gun is. So when does a true gun emerge? It emerges in China in the course of the 1200s, probably, and they were used in warfare in massive set of wars between the Chinese and their enemies, the Qin dynasty and the Yan, or the Mongols. And there was a bunch of wars in that period, and guns were used there. But the most famous early use was by the Ming dynasty. In the 1350s, China was battling. Lots of people in China were battling to unify China again after the previous dynasty was starting to collapse. And the ones who won are the Ming dynasty. And people are arguing, especially Chinese historians are arguing that they did it, the Ming were able to do this because they had the most effective guns. The first major gunpowder army in history, the first gunpowder empire, was the Ming Empire. And I'm going to show you a clip from a dramatization of a story about the Ming founder, Zhu Yuanzhang. And this is a famous battle of 1363.
朱元璋的20万部队与陈友谅60万大军在鄱阳湖相遇，双方共出动战船2000余艘，展开了中国历史上最大的一场大水战。
大帅，前面翻的敌船！
小队，开炮！
So it's kind of dramatic, right? It's kind of fun. If you've seen Master and Commander, it's a little like that, only with special effects that are, you can tell they're little models. But if you look at the guns here, I mean, this looks like, you know, the classic guns of the age of pirates and the age of sail, right? And although it's true that the Chinese did use guns in this battle, and many, many guns, and they played an important role, they were not like this. It's a great series and fun series, but it's not exactly accurate. Chinese guns were small. In fact, all early guns throughout the world were small. And one of the things that historians have wondered is, why is it that Europeans seem to have been the first to make big guns, to make artillery, while the Chinese guns stayed small? So that's maybe an early divergence. Chinese guns stayed small. European guns started small, but got big pretty quickly, so that by the late 1300s, after the time of this battle, they had big guns. So why is that the case? And I think here's a way that the comparative study of civilization, the comparative study of different societies that so far apart, can shed some light. Imagine in your mind, I think the answer has to do with walls. Imagine in your mind a castle, a medieval, like a European castle. Get the image in your mind. It probably looks something like this, right? Turrets and all that stuff. And the walls would look something like this, right? This is St. George Castle in Lisbon. And it's a big castle, a very important medieval castle. And it looks like that. So now, picture Chinese walls. Those of you who have been to Xi'an, for example, or Nanjing and seen the walls there, you'll know that they're a bit different. Here are the walls of Xi'an. Now these walls are, this is from the top, right? Just look at how massive those walls are compared. These walls were rebuilt during the Ming period, so in the 1300s, late 1300s, but they were rebuilt according to an ancient plan. So the ancient walls built in around 200 BC were this wide, and maybe slightly less wide than this. And they were filled, whereas European walls were made out of stone, and therefore quite brittle. Chinese walls were filled with earth and much more sort of absorbent. And so Europeans began to use guns, large guns, to aim at walls. Now early on they didn't. As a matter of fact, early on they aimed their guns at walls to stop the bullets when they were testing. But gradually they realized that you could actually have, if you aimed a cannon, even modern artillery cannon, when the British in 1839 in the Opium War with modern industrial artillery, when they attacked walls like this, it was very hard for them to make a dent. So China didn't. There was no reason to make big guns. You just wanted to kill people with guns and maybe do some damage to ships, although that wasn't so important. You burn them instead. Walls were impervious to Chinese walls were impervious to artillery, whereas European walls would crack. And in fact, in the late 1400s and early 1500s, when the Europeans began building walls that were resistant to artillery, they adopted the principles of Chinese walls. They built them out of earth and encased them in stone like this, and made them wide and shorter and sloped. I think that's one of the reasons that there was a divergence in terms of size between East and West. And this is a very ancient, it goes all the way back, the earliest walls excavated in China, even going back to 4,000 or 5,000 years before the Common Era, were similarly just very, very wide like that. I don't think it was any kind of adaptation to artillery, it was just a cultural practice. Score one for a comparative history of Western civilization. Resolves a mystery in gunpowder history. Although I have to say, I mean, this is circumstantial evidence. I can't say for sure that this is what happened, but I think it's a pretty good guess. But let's move on. There's another mystery. Another mystery is Europeans became very successful with artillery, with large guns. But they didn't use guns on the battlefield as much early on. Infantry in the 1300s and 1400s, when guns arrived in Europe in the early 1300s, about 20, 25 years after that great explosion that I started out with. And the European guns began to be used only when they started aiming them at walls and made them bigger. Smaller guns were used a little bit, but not so much on the battlefield. So why is that? And let me just show you. This is, oh, by the way, you can bicycle on the walls of Xi'an. This is early on until the late 1400s and actually into the 1500s. This is about the proportion in which you'd see guns in European battles. The Chinese, though, were using 10% guns by 1380 and 33%, so 1 in every 3 soldiers, infantry soldiers, was armed with a firearm in the 1400s. And that's much, much, much higher than European levels. So why is that the case? It's a mystery. Was it because Chinese guns were better? Probably not. Probably they were roughly the same. If Chinese guns were better, they were only slightly better. So why were Europeans not using guns on the battlefield and Chinese were? Well, European historians have argued that one of the reasons that Europeans were so effective with guns is because they began to use them better in concert. And so the roots of modern drill have to do with, we have some soldiers here, it looks like, and y'all probably have to do a lot of drill training, is that right? You still do that? Are you ROTC or are you still?
ROTC.
ROTC. So do you still do sort of formations and training? Yeah. Well, the roots of that happened in the early modern period, in the 1500s, and especially the late 1500s, the early 1600s, because guns, early guns, obviously they weren't like machine guns, they couldn't fire very quickly. They had to be used in concert. So one guy shot and someone else shot then next, and you can see the development of this here in a letter in 1594. This is the letter from William Louis of Nassau. The Dutch supposedly invented this in 1594. So you can see A, B, C, D, E are all soldiers armed with muskets. And a musket was so slow to load and so slow to fire. You had to actually hold a burning match in your hand while you poured gunpowder in. One guy quipped that the musket would have been great if humans were, at the time, if humans had 3 hands instead of 2. So it took a long time. So A would fire, and then you'd go to the back. Well, all the A's would fire, and then they'd go to the back, and then B would fire, C would fire, etc. And by the time you got back to A, then A was ready to fire again. And that was the only way to get people to keep up a constant hail of lead. Otherwise, if you just all fired at once, by the time you were done loading, you were dead because the cavalry was on you or the enemy infantry was on you, etc. And so in order to do this, if you think about battle conditions, remember that they're doing this under fire. And so in order to make this work, although the concept is kind of easy, it took them a long time to enact it because when you're under fire, everything changes. And you have to have your discipline and your drill so ingrained that you can still be like there shooting when you'd probably really rather be running away or certainly not being there because you're about to get speared by a horseman, right? So they had to drill every day, and that meant you needed standing armies, and that meant you needed very careful supervision. And this practice of Dutch drill then spread from Holland to all the other countries in Europe. Dutch drill instructors went to Sweden and Spain and all over the place, and the drill manuals were published, and the most famous one was published in 1607, the year of the Gunpowder Plot. And it shows how to divide the act of firing. It was so complicated and so difficult that you had to divide it into 33 steps, and it shows the various steps. And then people had to drill doing these all in order to drum rolls and things like that. So it is said then that Europeans owed their success, their military success, not just to the fact that they had good guns, but even more importantly, to the fact that they were able to use them in concert much better than other people's. So that's a sort of civilizational point, right? And a lot of people have argued this and still argue this. But the Chinese were able to use guns on the battlefield much, much earlier than this. In the 1200s and certainly by the 1300s, mid-1300s, as I said, 10% of Chinese forces, infantry forces, were gunners. By the 1400s, 33%. And those proportions are not reached in Europe until the 1500s, middle of the 1500s. So why is that the case? Well, it turns out that the Chinese were also doing drill. And this is, by the way, Jeffrey Parker is a sort of one of the great military historians. And he wrote that the combination of drill with the use of firearms to produce volley fire, perfected through constant practice, this idea of constant practice is very, very important, proved the mainstay of Western warfare and the key to Western expansion for the next 3 centuries. Okay, so it's something kind of special to Europe. Although, as we'll see, it turns out maybe it's not so special. In the Tang Dynasty, there are manuals that describe exactly this, not with guns. The Tang Dynasty is 700s, this is, I think, 759, but with crossbows. The crossbow was for the Chinese the most important missile weapon. It was a key of Chinese warfare since the ancient period. And it had the same problem as guns, that it was slow to load. You fired and then it took a long time. So a bow, you could just shoot like this. Crossbow was more powerful, easier for a layman to use, but it took a long time to load. And so here you can see up there's a row of people, Fang, they're shooting the crossbow, the first row, and the other people, the other 2 rows behind here. So that row is the enemies that way, that top row is firing, and these other 2 rows on each side are loading the crossbow, or streaming the crossbow. And this text describes very clearly exactly the volley fire. The volley fire that the Europeans were discovering or rediscovering in 1600 or so was here in 759, and probably goes back to ancient times, actually, although we don't have such good evidence. Here's another one from a Song Dynasty one, saying the same thing, with adding another step, that these guys are stepping forward to fire, and these guys are stringing the crossbows, and those guys are firing. And it says very clearly that there can't be anyone in front of the crossbows, obviously. I mean, an archer can arc his fire, but a crossbow has to shoot pretty straight. So they have to be in the front, and that's why these texts describe discipline and drill so importantly. So drill was a key part of Chinese warfare, a very, very important part. So that when firearms began to be used, the Chinese began to adapt this method. So the first use of drill for firearms was, a volley fire for firearms, is a case in 1388 when the Ming Dynasty went to war against some Thai rebels, basically, in southwest China. So why is this important? Because Europeans have said that they owe their ascendancy to this ability for soldiers to work together, this idea of drill. But of course we see that in China that was already there. And again, this is another sort of advantage for the comparative study of Western civilization. No one has really pointed this out, this deep legacy of drill, leading to Chinese immediately adopting it for firearms. And that leads us to question some of these claims about the uniqueness of the West. So until, at this point still, right, until well beyond this point, the Chinese are ahead. Military balance clearly favors the Chinese in terms of weapons, in terms of drill, etc. The Europeans didn't drill on the battlefield for the most part. They didn't have standing armies, and so that's why they didn't use handguns on the battlefield until the 1500s or so. In the late 1400s, the early 1500s, they begin to do it, and because they begin to drill themselves. But the first divergence in favor of Europe happens in the middle of the 1400s, or the late 1400s. Around the end of the 1400s, Europeans begin to develop, and this is just a pictorial representation of it. You can see the 3 lines. Europeans develop what we would call the classic gun. It is thin in the front, thick in the back, and very long. And the length of it allows more energy to be imparted to the projectile. The longer it stays in the barrel, the faster it's going, and the more power it has when it emerges on the other side. And also you can make it thick at the end and thinner at the front because there's less chance that the thing's going to explode at the end, so it saves on weight. Now this happened in the 1400s, and this is when you begin to see Europeans excelling in the art of making guns. So why does it happen then? Because the Chinese, until that point, are going along in exactly that line. If you look at how long their guns are relative to the barrel, this is some research that we've done, you see that they're going in exactly the same direction as the Europeans. But around here, around 1440, they stop, and the Europeans keep going. So why? Why is that? And this is just some of the data. And I think it has to do with the amount and kind of warfare that the Chinese were engaged in. This is a series of data that we've generated at Emory that counts up the number of wars that, or battles that the Chinese were fighting through, and it goes back another 1,000 years beyond this. But I think I have a better image of it. So you can see here, there's a lot of warfare and a lot of warfare here, but there's a kind of lull in the late 1400s. Well, you see, if you compare it to, oops, sorry, if you compare it to Europe, you can't really see these numbers here. But this is, the blue is Europe, and the red is China, and both are a number of battles in each place. And you have to be careful about these data. They can't be compared directly, but patterns sort of can be compared. And the patterns show that the Chinese were fighting a lot more at exactly the time that they were pulling ahead. They were fighting each other, they were fighting other people. But when exactly the time that the Europeans were starting to pull ahead, they were fighting more. The blue happens there. So warfare patterns kind of changed. And actually, the farther you go into the modern world, the fewer battles the Chinese are fighting. Now, is this a sign of backwardness? And it especially happens in the later period. This is, you can't see these here again, but this is 1560s. This is the 1640s or so. The Chinese are fighting a lot. But here, especially in the 1700s, it's a period of unprecedented peace in China during the Qing dynasty. And that's exactly a time when Europeans are fighting more. So I think that a lot of the divergence can be understood by looking at the amount of fighting within each area. So people have argued, most people have argued, when you ask someone, well, why didn't China continue to develop guns and why did Europe? They'll usually give you an answer like Europeans were more curious, or they were more, right, and Chinese had Confucianism, and Confucianism was not very open to military. The Confucians thought that military matters were kind of beneath them and less important, and there may be some truth to that. But it's also the case that when there was warfare in China, in these periods when you needed to be, the Confucian scholars who had spent all their lives memorizing Mencius and writing 8-line essays, these very ornate and esoteric forms, they immediately became interested in guns. And one of the most famous elements is in around 1519 or so, one of the most famous Confucians. So you could say that aside from Confucius himself, there are three great Confucians. One is Mencius, or Mengzi. Another one is Zhu Xi in the Song period, who's a great Confucian. And the third was a guy named Wang Yangming, who lived in the Ming period. And in 1519, Wang Yangming was faced with a big rebellion. And he was his enemies, there were Chinese enemies. He was a Ming prince who wanted to overthrow the throne. Details aren't important, but what is important is that this enemy began to arm himself with Western cannons. The Portuguese had arrived in China in early 1500s, and immediately these Chinese rebels began to arm themselves with Portuguese cannons. Well, Wang Yangming also began to try to do that, and one of his friends famously sent him some Portuguese cannons, or Portuguese guns. And then all the Confucians in this circle, all these gentlemen who knew each other, they began to write poems about this. Because this man, he was an old man, and he was sickly at the end of his life, and he went out and he immediately began to forge these cannons and then sent them. It was very hot, and his servants went over hill and dale and nearly died, but they got them there and to help Wang Yangming. And Wang Yangming was so happy about this that he cried, and he writes about this. And then all the Confucians began to write all these poems about Frankish cannons, about Portuguese cannons. So we had this whole poetry exchange, one of their favorite things to do about Portuguese cannons. And this event. Here's, this is one of the sort of a pictorial thing. Now the person who drew this, like this, these don't look like Portuguese cannons, right? They're pretty small. So the person who drew this didn't know, but all the Confucians who wrote these poems knew about Portuguese cannons, because at that point, the Ming government was also excitedly adopting them. So that within a decade or two, they were bristling from the Great Wall. So you can't say, although you could say that the Europeans pulled ahead, the Chinese were adapting and adopting very quickly. And not only were they adopting these cannons, they weren't just copying them slavishly, they were innovating. They used different ways of constructing them, more advanced metallurgical techniques. They made them in different sizes and adapted them to all sorts of conditions, some for boats, some for walls, some for hand-to-hand, not hand-to-hand, but some for infantry combat, etc. So to say that Confucians were not interested in these military things is not true. They found enormous interest in it, and they adapted and adopted very quickly and nativized these guns. And in fact, they became Chinese guns in the same way that the Europeans adopted cannons and guns from China. So the Chinese readopted them when they came and were ready to do them very fast. So in this period of adoption continued throughout the 1600s and during that whole period of warfare in the 16th century, in 1500s. That warfare translated into more eager adoptions. So handguns, and you saw the classic handgun. This is the classic handgun that emerged about 1480 or so. Looks like this is when the musket emerged. So Europeans, at the same time as they developed this classic cannon, they developed a classic handgun, or firearm, because it's a two-armed gun. They began then to bring them to the east, and then Chinese adopted them very quickly. And this is a military manual from one of the most famous military thinkers of China in the sort of late imperial period, the Ming Qing. And he's talking about muskets and how great they are and how effective they are. And he began to adopt them on a massive scale to fight against Japanese pirates. And the pirates were invading southern China. And he adopted them very quickly. And in fact, the first, so we'll get back to the musketry volley technique. So Geoffrey Parker and others say that the Europeans were the first to use muskets in volley technique in the late 16th century, right? This data right here shows that as soon as muskets arrived in China, they were adapted with the same methods that would later be used by the Europeans. So in a way, it's not that the Chinese were catching up. In a way, they were ahead in this period. And this is, as you can see, this is the classic one with crossbow. You can see instantly how, and this is with muskets, how they've immediately adopted it for muskets. This is a later image, but the principle holds true. And I have, because no one has really said this before, I have some evidence here, just in case anyone doesn't believe me, about how they divided up into layers. Each layer fires Fang one after the other 5 horn tones, and they did this all to music. There's a lot of music and drum beats and horns, and everyone had to do exactly what they were told. And discipline was harsh and very stringent. So this is, we don't have to go through this actual text. So here it shows you that you don't have to divide into 2 layers of 5. They have 10 man units. You could divide into, 5 layers of 2, you could divide into 2 layers of 5. So there was a lot of flexibility, which also shows the amount of discipline that was needed, the amount of training that was needed to do this. Because to get people to stand in concert in all these lines and do these different formations took huge amounts of training. And this military manual and other military manuals detail all that training. So the musket volley technique was used first probably in China. And most historians wouldn't agree that, wouldn't know that this is the case. Some people say maybe Japan was the first, most people say Europe was the first. Okay. And one of the interesting things is that this spread beyond China, these military manuals and these practices, because China wasn't the only place that was sort of convulsed in warfare during this period. Japan was also, only place outside of Europe, obviously. Japan was also, Korea was also. Japan invaded Korea in 1592, and the Koreans were just overwhelmed. The Japanese had been fighting amongst themselves, and so they became very effective. And then when they invaded Korea, the Koreans were overwhelmed, and then they began to adopt these Chinese models. And so this is a model, a pictorial representation of a musketry volley technique in the Korean manual. And here you can see these guys have stepped forward to the very front, and they are holding up and firing to Fang, and the others are loading or ready to fire or empty. So these military manuals spread beyond China, and large parts of East Asia, Korea, and Vietnam, and other parts of the surrounding areas adopted them very avidly, and the practices spread and the technology spread as well. Other canons also were adopted at this period. Anything that they saw, and this is there's a guy named Quanning who's written some amazing pieces about this. He's based in Taiwan, and he says many scholars have argued that the Chinese contented themselves with imitating Western levels of cannon casting and technology, but in fact, in the Ming Dynasty, which was a time known for its ironcraft, the Ming, after adopting advanced Western techniques, also dashed forward and developed their own new technologies for manufacturing cannons, so that at the end of the Ming, they were casting the world's highest quality iron bronze composite cannons, which are, the Europeans couldn't do anything like it. Wrapping bronze and iron together made them much more effective. The bronze diffused the heat better, the iron, anyway, there's a number of reasons that it was the most effective cannons, and cheap. They were cheaper than pure bronze cannons. This fact is not only not nearly recognized enough by Ming Qing social specialists, it has also not been recognized by modern historians in general. So the extent of Chinese adaptability and innovation and dynamism militarily in the 1600s and 1700s hasn't really been appreciated. And in fact, there were wars between Europeans and Chinese. And Steve mentioned one of my books which looks at the Taiwan War, and this is a still picture from the period of the Taiwan War. There were two major conflagrations that the Chinese armies, or armies of East Asia, met up with Europeans in. One is this war, 1661 to 62. Another one, and that was against the great maritime power, the Dutch. They were the great power of the world, right? The great power, at least the great maritime power of the world in those days. But there was also a war that the Chinese forces fought against the Russians. And in both cases, the Chinese won. Now, in both cases, the Chinese outnumbered the Europeans. And I think that you can find evidence suggesting that the Europeans did have certain military advantages. But those advantages were emphatically not in terms of handguns and discipline, like military historians have argued. And this is a battle that the Dutch faced. I think this is the Chinese army here, this is the Dutch army. This is this is all the Chinese army, sorry. This is the Dutch army. And in this battle, the Dutch commander and his musketeers are marching very confidently forward, firing in turns, but the Chinese completely defeat them, also because the Chinese basically send a detachment around the back, and the Dutch had been using scouts and didn't know this. So anyway, the Dutch completely failed. And on other land battles in this war, it was similar. And the same with the Russians. The Russians were also famous for their volley fire and their disciplined techniques, which had helped them go all the way over in their eastern expansion in the 17th century. But when they met the Qing dynasty in the north, and the Koreans, they were completely outfought, and the Korean musketeers fought the Russians to a standstill. So, in terms of land battles, the Europeans were defeated quite easily, and I think that there's no advantage for land forces. In terms of the guns themselves, the guns that the Chinese forces brought were as good as or better than those of Europe. So this is 1670s or so that were the Europeans, in terms of guns, in terms of land battles, in terms of tactics, were not more advanced. But they did hold certain advantages. And one of those advantages had to do with ships. European ships had two basic effective things about them vis-a-vis Chinese ships. One is that they were filled with cannons. So they might have 2 decks of cannons. They were sturdy big ships. Chinese ships are more like this, smaller. And although they had cannons in them, they had been developed not for blue water fighting, not for deep water fighting, but for coastal fighting and for river fighting. Like the lake battle that I showed you of the Ming. A lot of the battles in China took place on lakes and in rivers. And so when it came to battles in the open sea, European ships were much more effective. They could liberate they could hold themselves against 10 times, 20 times as many smaller Chinese ships. They were also, that was the first advantage, that they were just effective as cannon platforms and blasting with it to hit other ships. But another advantage was their rigging. Chinese ships had sort of very simple rigging. You can see here they were bamboo lateen sails. Well, actually not lateen, but bamboo sails, flat sails. And when Chinese would describe European ships, they would describe this spider web of rigging. And so if you know, like, you've seen Master Commander, one of those, and pirate movies, you know, people are always crawling all over the rigging like spiders. The Chinese thought this was very interesting and unusual. And they also noted that European ships were better at sailing close to the wind. So since everything was wind powered, to get to be more maneuverable, it would help if you can sail different ways. Well, European rigging allowed the sailing much closer to the wind, and so this happened on several occasions during the war. This allowed the Europeans to get places where the Chinese didn't expect them. And in other cases during the war, if the Chinese had an ability to sail closer to the wind, they would have gotten more supply. So I think it's a very important, there's two things about ships, the cannon carry capacity and the rigging and the deep hulls that allow European ships to be more effective in deep water combat. But of course the Chinese often lure the Europeans into shallow water combat. You couldn't always fight in the open seas, and many naval battles were won by the Chinese because not all conditions could be just suited to the deep water capacities. So that's one advantage that Europeans had. Their ships were probably more effective on the open water. Another advantage was in the Renaissance fortress. So this is a fortress that is constructed along lines when Europeans realized that their walls crumbled when faced with artillery. They began to build new kinds of walls, and I mentioned that they built them lower and filled with earth. They also began adding bastions, haunted bastions. And you can see this, and this is a Russian siege. This is the Chinese fortress that they built, and that is a European fortress. That's the Russian fortress. And you can see these angled bastions sticking out like arrows. And the classic European Renaissance fortress, which was developed by Renaissance architects and famous people like Leonardo, I worked on them, Leonardo da Vinci, they were able to defend enormously effectively and fire in all sorts of overlaying, it's called geometric defense. So there was nowhere you could get that you wouldn't be shot by guns and artillery in those bastions. And so in both cases, there were two sieges, well, there were various sieges, but I look at two sieges. This one, the Chinese set themselves up and thought that they would be able to take this little fortress quite easily, and they couldn't. It completely baffled them. They were slaughtered on the battlefield, and it took them a long time, and it wasn't until there was a defector, a drunken German guy, who alcohol had gotten very, very expensive in the fort. So if you like alcohol, never get trapped inside a fortress with very few supplies. I calculated that it cost, for a 6-pack of beer, it cost the equivalent of about $500, $600. And so people who wanted alcohol had a really hard time. And so anyway, he went over to the Chinese side and told them how to take the fortress by building a huge number of batteries all around in various places and inching closer and closer to the fortress. And the same sort of thing happened in the Russian case. But we see that a small number of European defenders were able, thanks to this technology, this fortress, this architecture, to fight off much larger numbers of enemies. So in those two cases, I think that Europeans had an advantage. But when did the big divergence come? We talk about a great divergence economically between Europeans and Chinese happening around 1800. That's what the revisionists say. So when did a military great divergence happen? Well, I think it happened around the same time. And again, it happened because of patterns of warfare. If we look at Chinese warfare, this is 1307. If you just look at these charts, where do you see the least number of wars? Here, right? After about 1379 to 1830. So what happened in the 1830s? That was the Opium War. So this period, leading right up to the Opium War, is the period in China's history. And if I extended these data backwards, you'd see that this is unprecedented. Never in Chinese history have there been less wars than in precisely the period in which Europeans were accelerating their divergence. And let me just skip to, is this the one? I'm sorry, I've got so much data and I'm getting out of time. Yeah, this is the one. So here is the period in the 1700s. Well, look what Europeans are doing. Here, European warfare seems to be around the level, and again, we can't compare directly, but it seems to be around the level of the Chinese, and with certain points when the Chinese warfare accelerated in this war. Here, precisely when Chinese wars were the least, European wars were getting more and more and more intense with a tremendous spike in the Napoleonic period. And this is exactly when Europeans were beginning to really draw ahead. So this is the period of the Great Divergence, the Great Military Divergence. But is it due to luck? That the Europeans go ahead? Or are they just, maybe the Chinese are too peaceful, maybe they're too lucky, they have less war. Or is it due to something else? Are there deeper roots? Well, clearly I think it's definitely the case that just patterns of warfare, you don't have to talk about culture, you don't have to talk about science or intellectual culture or Confucianism and the impediments to curiosity supposedly in China. You can just say that the Chinese were out of practice because whereas Europeans were fighting a lot, the Chinese didn't have to. And so it's no wonder that when the British arrived in 1839 with their steamboats and their guns blazing, that the Chinese aren't prepared. Why should they be? They didn't face anything like that for generations. But I think, and so in a way, this idea supports the revisionist perspective. The revisionism that it's not anything necessarily culturally deep. It's something that happens later. We see a parity or inequality, at least between Chinese and Europeans, through the period of the early 1700s, and I would say you could see that probably through about here at least. So the roots aren't necessarily deep, but actually I do think, and I've come to feel that the roots are actually a little deeper than that, because the traditionalist perspective is not just that the divergence occurred earlier than the world historians and with all their PC ideas would like you to believe or anything. It's not just that the divergence was later, but also that the roots of it were deep. The roots of it had to do, go back in some cases, Max Weber, for example, the great German sociologist, traces the roots to Moses. Like the Moses laws laid the roots for the later divergence between East and West. Other people maybe don't go that far, but they think that it had to do with the Renaissance, it had to do with science and the Greeks and things like that. Is that the case? Well, I think that yes, I think that science actually plays an important role. I don't know about representative government and forms of freedom and legal structures. I think the research on that is out. But certainly, at a certain point, precisely during this time, Europeans were not just fighting more, they were also developing new ways of understanding the world. Science in the late 17th century, so actually throughout the 17th century, especially in the late 17th century, a period when Isaac Newton was formulating his laws of motion, and Robert Boyle was formulating the gas laws. So if any of you have taken chemistry, you know these are famous laws, and rightly so. This was, in 1742, a Brit named Benjamin Robbins developed a way to measure the energy of a projectile. Before that, they really couldn't. And actually, before that, people didn't know whether a projectile, you're probably told in physics class, right, that when you shoot a gun and drop something, right, they land at the same time. The Renaissance people, they kind of understood that, but they didn't know how the arc went. They thought that it went like this and then dropped. And that's because they didn't understand wind pressure. The idea that we are living at the bottom of a sea of pressurized gas, right? This is something that, a fish is in water. A fish doesn't understand that there's water all around, right? In the same way, we don't realize that we're living in a deep pressure environment. And that matters a lot because he managed to measure using his ballistic pendulum and using the equations of Newton and the equations of Robert Boyle, that wind resistance was enormously important. That it was important, so much more important that it actually made sense to make cannons shorter and shoot slower, and you would actually end up with more power. Bigger bullets, slower, actually do more damage. You couldn't have done that without these late 17th century developments. He calculated it's amazing what he did. He calculated the rate of expansion of gunpowder using the gas law, so as the solid turns into a gas, and figured out how much pressure that would impart, and then he measured it experimentally and came up with a constant in the whole equation to do it. Couldn't have done that without Newton. Newton to convert forward momentum to angular momentum and measure it, and Boyle, the gas laws, to convert how this reaction into energy, and all laid out in terms of mathematics. The Chinese were doing nothing like this, and I think that's very important. And so later, when the steam engine came about, now how many people think they know how a steam engine works? I'm almost done. I'm sorry, I get very excited. I'm almost done. How many people think they know how does a steam engine work? Yes, how does it work?
Expanding gas, steam condenses.
Yeah, so the expanding gas is here, right? And then what happens?
And it expands.
Yeah, so that's what most people say, exactly what you're saying, that it expands here and pushes the piston. Actually, the work is done not by the expansion of the gas. The expansion of the gas just kind of slowly drives up the piston. The work is done when the vacuum is created by squirting cool water and suddenly removing the expanded gases, and the atmospheric pressure, this great soup that we're living under, pushes down really fast and really hard. That's what drives it. So you can see it's actually going up. It's doing the work. It's pulling the water up from the well. On the downstroke, that wouldn't have been possible. People didn't understand until we understood that we were living in this great pressure environment. And that took a long time to understand. It was only in the course of the 17th century. This scientific knowledge was important. So people ask why, once China started to understand how backward it was in 1839 with the Opium War, right? The British just ran over China very quickly, and it was an enormous loss for the Chinese. And why didn't they adapt very quickly? Well, I think one of the reasons, first of all, they did adapt much more quickly. They tried to adapt much more quickly. They built working models of steamships relatively fast, but they couldn't convert they couldn't convert them into large working models because Europeans have been doing this for a century by this point. And one reason is some recent research shows that it's because the Chinese didn't have technical drawing. So if anyone tells you that art isn't so important in science, art is enormously important. The Chinese, so technical drawing allows you to represent in two-dimensional space, three-dimensional objects. And there's all these, a long tradition of it. So these are images of steam engines, but they couldn't be converted in workshops into the working thing because people who tried to read them couldn't understand them very well. Here's an example. This is the European technical drawing. You can see that there's all conventions that you know that these things are inside and kind of invisible. And this was an attempt to reproduce that. This is from the 1600s, so this is an old tradition. You can see that there's no way you could get something working from this, but you could from this. So this idea of technical drawing was important. Also, machine tools. So these little things with so much accretion, they actually turned out, I think, to be very important. In terms of the argument, and I really am almost done, in terms of the argument between traditionalists and revisionists, I think that the timing supports the revisionist perspective. But the roots, especially science, I think go deep. And science is a very, something that we should really revere, and I think be very, very proud of, whoever we are. Now, some people say that Newtonian physics was an accident. That if it hadn't been for certain political developments in England, the period which allowed the Anglican Church to stay independent of Catholicism, that Newton wouldn't have been adopted in England and then it wouldn't have spread. There's little contingencies. This is a revisionist who makes this argument that, okay, so the Europeans had science, but still they were lucky that it got to stick and it could have gone a different way. Well, I don't know, maybe there's some truth to that. And actually, maybe if the gunpowder of Guy Fawkes had actually exploded when he was in Parliament, something totally different would have happened and we all would be here giving this talk in Chinese. But thank you very much for